Let's begin.
Burn, ungodly filth!
What do you want? To make you ours or to make you despair?
Spirit Blade Productions presents...
Do you have any idea how much I will make you suffer? The horrific agony that I will inflict.
Spirit Blade, Dark Ritual.
Hell will be a refuge for you when I'm finished. For more information, visit spiritblade.com.
I do not understand what I do, but for what I want I do, Chesed, son of Shalom, Ahiez, or Pedaz, or... That really means something, doesn't it? Okay, well, right now we're going to attempt to examine the Bible. See, I'm already doing this differently than I'm used to doing it. I examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language that we often take for granted, digging into history and languages as we're able to try and get at the heart of the text so we can hopefully see and apply some of what God has for us in these words today. And now, we're not formally trained in Scripture. We're just a couple guys using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth. Questioning minds. We have one of those for each of us. And that's something that we can all do, so I hope you'll do that with us. I'm Peter France, and I'm way up in the corner here. Hi! I'm saying we and us because I've invited John Wilkerson, who is larger on your screen if you're watching the YouTube version of this. John's going to help me to look at the book of Proverbs with all you guys. Thank you so much, John, for doing this with me.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here. I think you mentioned a couple years ago you were thinking about going through Proverbs, and I reached out to you then, so I'm excited to do this.
It's been a while. I didn't realize it'd been that long, but I mean that doesn't surprise me. It's for those of you who don't know John, John's been part of the Christian Geek Central community since long before it was called that.
Yeah.
He's been a podcaster for many years. And when he heard that I was going to take on Proverbs, he had some experience in the book, had been through a study several times, and so he offered to kind of help lighten the load for me, as it were. And I took him up on that offer because in all my interactions with John on the forums or privately, or in all the times I've seen him interact with others, I've just noticed that he's got a humble grace and a sensitivity and a self-control that he brings in equal proportion to his wisdom and a sort of grounded level-headedness. You're being tested by your praise now here, John. He's a guy who's lived more life than most people his age, having now... How many kids do you have, John?
I have 7.
7. Okay, so if that doesn't give you opportunities to stretch and grow, I don't know what does. So Anyway, I just thought it was a unique situation and a unique opportunity. So, like I said, John, I'm really glad to have you here with us. The format for this, guys, is going to be different from the normal study format that I use. You'll notice it maybe even more so if you're watching the YouTube version. I will read some prepared notes of mine now and then. Both John and I are bringing notes to this, but much of the time we're just going to try and talk through each chapter of Proverbs and maybe not touch on every verse, but definitely spend time talking about the verses and the truths that stand out to us and how we see them as relevant to the sort of day-to-day grind that we all have to face in our various circles of work or family or social and church life and stuff like that. So I want to briefly just give some background on the book of Proverbs. It's a mix of seemingly original material and also restatements of Proverbs previously found in literature actually outside of Israel. And this kind of thing is found in other places in Scripture too. I mean, God doesn't have any problems with appropriating things from pre-existing sources into words that He's then directing toward His people, and there's could be multiple reasons for that. Maybe it's easier to teach something using concepts that your audience is already familiar with, or because by God's sovereignty some truths were just stated well in other places, and so they're just worth repeating as they are. In any case, regardless of the textual origin, these words are all kind of given God's stamp of approval, as it were, by being included in this book, and were ultimately brought about by His sovereign will and inspiration, regardless of their source. Now, the book of Proverbs is traditionally understood to be authored by King Solomon. There has been some disagreement on this point over the years, but more recently, scholars seem to be, in what I've read, increasingly attributing most of the book to Solomon. Whatever the particulars of its origin, though, it was recognized as the Word of God during and following the time of Christ's ministry on earth, and that's really key. So in addition to being the words of wise men, Proverbs also faithfully presents the words of God that we can and should still aim to apply appropriately to our lives today. And I want to land on that word appropriately and toss it over to you, John, because you've been through a complete study of Proverbs several times. What would you say are like some general tips or that you've picked up, or pitfalls you've learned to avoid when navigating your way through this book?
Well, I think the biggest tip, number one, is that we need to realize when we're looking at Proverbs and we're reading Proverbs, especially in English, that the English meaning of a word is not necessarily the meaning of the word in the original language. And so it's important to really look and see what that original language actually said, because translators, they do the best that they can to get that across, but it doesn't always come across. We also need to keep in mind the people that this was written to and the mindset that they had and their culture, and how that is very foreign to us who live in a Western world and don't, I mean, you do hear a lot about patriarchy now, but it's nothing like it was back then. And so that factors into that as well. And also, just that one of the things we need to see is that there is not everything here is necessarily biblical advice or spiritual advice. There's practical advice, and sometimes it's just observations that Solomon made, like we'll get once we get way down there about how he recognizes how bribes work in politics and things like that. So oftentimes people will take they'll pluck a little couplet out of Proverbs and say, "Oh, this is a promise for me," and it's not. No, it's not. So those are important things to think. And I really like the fact that these Proverbs, they're kind of these pithy sayings, kind of like, here's one that I think David Guzik used this in his commentary notes. Many hands make light work. That's a proverb that we know. But too many cooks spoil the broth. So it's kind of, sometimes Solomon makes these statements and they're either just observations or things like that. And it's not a spiritual prescription for us. It's or it could just be a description of something, and it's important to kind of figure out where exactly that's going on, and not take a general principle and apply it to spiritual matters.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the thing about promises too, because I think there can be a mode of thinking where you look at Proverbs and say, okay, this is how things are always going to be, and instead it's laying down a principle of how things tend to be under a number of circumstances. But it's not like, and this also isn't a book that is a recipe for winning at life, whatever, and winning at life. Well, what is according to whose definition of winning and stuff like that, and so. That said, it's certainly, wisdom certainly does help us to avoid a number of troubles. It doesn't make our lives trouble-free. In fact, some people, their lives become noticeably more difficult after becoming believers than before, I really liked how the Expositor's Bible Commentary summarized the purpose of Proverbs. They said, the book of Proverbs is a marvelous collection of wise sayings and instructions for living a useful and effective life. So whether those come in I don't think they're saying, as you were warning against, that everything is like, do this. But they're observations, they're insights that equip us to become more useful and effective in being representatives of Yahweh.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, so we're actually, in this first go, John and I are sitting down and we're going to do probably a bunch of recording all at once, maybe more than one session, we'll see. But in this series, we're actually not going to go through the entire book of Proverbs without break. We're going to go through chapters 1 through 5 over the course of this series. Then we'll take a break, and I think we'll do James, the entire book of James after that. Then we'll come back and do some more Proverbs, then probably another book of the Bible, then come back. So we're kind of alternate and take Proverbs kind of in chunks, because there is the potential to kind of zone out or tune out, if you stay, especially when you get later to the couplets like you were talking about, John, then it can be easy to kind of tune out if you stay there for too long. So for the sake of freshness, that's the way we're going to approach it. And we're just going to take a run at like basically a chunk of verses at a time that I'll read from the ESV translation, and then we'll just open it up between me and John to see kind of what our reactions are and what we've read and learned as we've looked at these verses in advance, and just kind of share some of our observations. So, okay, so Proverbs 1, we'll look at the chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. In the ESV, it says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So there you have it, 1 through 7 of chapter 1. Anything jump out at you there?
Well, a ton of things. Well, first of all, obviously, we get the authorship of the book of Proverbs, and you would think in that first verse, there's probably not much there to talk about. But remember, original language. When someone hears the name Solomon, what they hear is peaceful, because that's how it translates. And so when you think about, that's one of the things that to keep in mind as we go through here. If you want to live a peaceful life, if you want to live in peace with God, here are some ways to do it. Son of David, that obviously has tons of connotations, Christological connotations, and also it shows that he is the rightful heir and king of Israel. So there is a lot there. And then Solomon goes into what the purpose of Proverbs is. So he says, "Hey, I'm Solomon. I wrote this. Here's why I wrote it." And just like if you were writing a modern self-help book, what's the first thing you would do? This is who I am. This is why I have authority to write this. Here's why I wrote it. And then you would go on and start giving your advice with examples and things like that. And so he mentions a number of things here. To know wisdom. We live in an information age, and facts and figures do not equal wisdom. And I think a lot of people feel like just because they have a little smartphone that they can look anything up.
Yeah.
Hey, look, I'm smart because I have a smartphone. Or, well, you're wise. You don't know how to use that information. And a lot of times that information can be misused. And so that's pretty important. He talks about perceiving understanding. And I talked about that earlier, about how when you're looking at these verses, it's not just a matter of reading it, but you really need to look deep. When you're perceiving something, you're not just glancing at it or passing over it. You're looking at it with intent. Receiving wisdom. So when you hear this, you'll gain wisdom. Just so many people know, I may be using phrases that are from the New King James Version, because that's what I used when I put 90% of my notes together. So it usually lines up with the ESV. The New King James and the ESV usually line up. So if something doesn't line up, just say something. And then You know, I looked here, the New English translation, where it says about receiving wisdom. It says that this is instruction for skillful living, and that is something that gives us. You know, many kids, and I know this because I've raised a couple of them. Many kids go out into the world with a lot of information, but they don't know how to use that information properly. And one of the things that I hope to do, that I hope I've done with my kids, is taught them how to gather information, process it, and then use it correctly. And I have a little note here that I'd like to, verses 1 through 6, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Yeah. You know, it's solving the riddles of life. I wish when I was younger I had paid a little bit closer attention to Proverbs, because there were a lot of riddles I would have solved a lot sooner as a young person. And then the fear of the Lord being the beginning of knowledge, and how that fools despise wisdom and instruction. And as we go along in Proverbs, you'll hear a lot about the scoffer and the person who scoffs at God and scoffs at wisdom. We're going to hear a lot about that person who has hardened their heart so much that when they hear wisdom, they can't even receive it. And so hopefully, as we're going through this, and as people are listening or watching this, their heart is being softened and is turning into good ground for the seed of the word. And I think that's probably about it, without going into too much depth here.
Yeah, and on that last point, you know, how we're going to see more about this, the scoffer, and that's going to be contrasted with the wise or the righteous, you know, that we are dealing with these kind of archetypes here, and so it's a good idea as we're reading through to not like think to myself, well, I'm glad I'm not that guy, you know, he's evil through and through and stuff, but you know,
yeah.
but I think we ought to ask ourselves, okay, how much do I line up with the archetype of the wise and the righteous, and how much and how often am I lining up with the scoffer, you know, or with the wicked or whatever, you know?
Right. And the interesting thing about Proverbs is, although it is certainly one of the, it's considered one of the books of wisdom, along with Job and Psalms and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon's, but it's also a very poetic book. Yeah, it uses a lot of imagery, and it's important to note that when, you know, because sometimes even in English we'll take poetic license when we're talking about a situation. You know, oh yeah, I went for a run the other day and it was so hot I almost died. Now, maybe you really did almost die because it's 115 degrees outside and you didn't bring any water with you. But more than likely you really didn't almost die. And that there's a lot of that in Proverbs when we talk about something leading to death. Yeah. It doesn't mean that if you do this, in 5 minutes you're going to be dead. Mm-hmm. It's poetry. It's meant to shock you and consider your actions so that those things don't happen later.
Yep. All right, let's see what jumped out to me here. The word wisdom is interesting to me. I'm not going to say much on it now, but I think it's interesting how, you know, you can go to a lexicon and it's kind of like the word for blessed or happy. You can go to a Hebrew lexicon and you'll get the base definition, but it's really only through seeing it repeatedly used in context that you understand. It's like there's this building definition of what it means to be wise, you know, and like one of the first building blocks they give here is that the fear of Yahweh, that's the beginning. You start there if you want to understand what wisdom is. You fear Yahweh, you know. Let's see here. I like in verse 4 and 5, you know, how we see that Proverbs are for everybody. They give prudence and knowledge and discretion to the beginner, and they increase knowledge and guidance for those who have already developed some wisdom. So no matter where we're at, this is a book that we can come back to again and again. I appreciate you bringing out the difference between having a powerful intellect and knowing how to use that knowledge and apply it to life. I think that's a huge point of distinction. The idea of fearing Yahweh has the potential, I think, for some knee-jerk reactions to one extreme or the other. I think that a fire and brimstone preacher can emphasize it to the detriment of understanding God's love and compassion. On the other hand, from what I've come to understand, it is more than just respect. How sometimes we want to like ease off and say, well, we don't want to be terrified of God, so it's just respect. It's just respect. Well, it's more than just respect. Comparing it to and I also think it gets problematic when we try to compare it to the fear that one has for like your father's discipline, because that's a sketchy metaphor because so many people have had really bad experiences with their father.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but the Expositor's Bible Commentary says the word for fear, when referring to God, quote, captures both aspects of shrinking back in fear and of drawing close in awe. It's not a trembling dread that paralyzes action, but neither is it a polite reverence, Do you have any thoughts on the idea of fearing God and how that's the beginning point for gaining wisdom?
Just that it's one of those things where if you're really going to tap into who God is, you need to be aware of all of what and I know we can't know all, but we need to recognize both sides of who God is. And I think it was right, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when C.S. Lewis writes about Aslan, about how he's both beautiful and dreadful at the same time, and that is God.
He's not a tame lion, but he's good.
But he's good,
which is really interesting to sit in that tension of, it's like, oh man, my life might totally hit the fan, and yet the guy that's ultimately allowing that to happen or bringing some things about is good, and he can be trusted. That's like, ugh.
I mean, think about when you go to the zoo and you see a wild animal, and whether it's on the other side of glass or across a moat or whatever, you look at the animal over there and it's just so majestic and it looks wonderful until they're ready to feed it. and once they feed that animal, you see how fierce it is and how powerful it is. And I think it's the same way with God. There are times when we look at him and we see his majesty and his grace and his mercy, and then there are other times when we look at him and we say, wow, he really does hold my life in his hands, in my hand. My life is held in his hands, and it's his to control. And he determines what happens in my life. And that's that fear. That's that we're in awe of who he is, but we also recognize that, for whatever reason, in his will, he has determined the beginning and the end of my life, and and everything that happens in between it. And so we live in that I like to call it deep reverence, because of how we recognize and realize his power in our lives.
Yeah.